Hey guys, it's Mike here, and over the course of my time in the Dragon Ball fandom, I've heard of a number of different theories. Many of these theories have to do with in-universe mechanics, how things work, and how the greater in-universe story unfolds. However, every now and then, I'll hear a really interesting theory that has to do with the narrative itself. And one such theory is what I'm going to be talking about in this video, which is something that has to do with the timelines, or more specifically, the ones that we observe throughout the story. And that is, did the Dragon Ball story switch timelines during Dragon Ball Z, more specifically during the Cell Saga? And also, if it did, what are the ramifications not just on that arc, but every other arc moving forward? Well, let's get into that right now. So this theory proposes that up until the point of the Frieza arc, and really everything before that, everything is taking place in one timeline. The original timeline in this case. Because for all we know, every single thing that occurs up until the point of the Cell Saga's beginning is the same in the main timeline as it was in the original and every other timeline. It really begins to diverge when we get into the actual events of the Cell Saga. And to give more of an explanation as to how the time travel basically works for people who might not be aware, basically we're explained this by Trunks, Gohan, and some of the others when they're speculating about time travel during the Cell arc. More specifically, Trunks brings up the idea of, how about this? I go further into the past with my time machine and destroy the androids before they're activated. We know where Dr. Gero's lab is now. And then of course, Yamcha's saying that he thinks it'll work. At this point, Krillin intervenes and he says, wait, didn't you say the time machine isn't perfect? And Goku told me it takes a long time to charge it for the trip and back. Will you be able to get back to the future after going further in the past? I don't know. So of course, Trunks came from his own timeline to the past, quote unquote, which is really the past of another timeline that was created by time travel. By who is what I'll get into shortly. At this point, Gohan intervenes in the conversation. He says, I was thinking, if Trunks does go to the past and destroys the androids, what's going to happen to the androids in the present? Are they going to disappear? And then Trunks says, oh, that's right. The future of that timeline would be saved from the androids, but there would be no change in this timeline where the androids already exist. Krillin says, what do you mean? Okay, for example, says Trunks, your Goku's life was saved by the medicine I brought from the future, but in my timeline, Goku still died from this virus. In other words, there's both a future in which Goku has died and one in which he has lived. Kind of almost like Schrodinger's cat or the kind of quantum ideas. And one in which he lived, as I said, each change in the past creates new futures. Wait a second, then even if Goku defeats the androids here, wouldn't they still exist in your future? That's right. Yamcha asks, then what was the point of you coming to the past? Your future isn't going to change. And then Trunks says, Mom said it's so horrible what the androids did to us that there deserves to be a peaceful future where they've been destroyed. But also, maybe I could find their weakness by watching Goku fight them. And if that didn't work, then maybe we could bring Goku to our future with the time machine. But I've come to a past that's slightly different from the one I knew. The timing of Goku's illness was different. There are 3 androids, and they're much, much stronger. If they really are, well, I speculated on that in another video you could see on my channel. But why is it different? I don't know. What changed? Is it because I used the time machine before? And so this basically explains that in Dragon Ball, the way that time travel works in its own in-universe way is basically that there was one timeline initially, and then Trunks, the original future Trunks from the true original timeline, went back in time after the androids wiped everyone out and Goku had died of the heart virus. At that point, when he went to the past, just because he was present in the past now, that's a change from the original timeline, which means that he created a new timeline. That was the unseen timeline, not the main one that we're looking at right now. The main timeline and all these other changes that Trunks are talking about actually was created 1 year before this Trunks went back in time. And by who, you may ask? Well, right here is when we get the explanation. The other time machine arrived a year before, and who is the one that was piloting it? None other than Cell. And Cell even goes on to explain more about this when he's in his showdown with Piccolo, and he starts to discuss what exactly occurred. where he says that not only is he an android, that he sent himself and the machine was too small, that's why he reverted back to his larval state. But when he actually got here, he said, and he explains in depth how the change occurred, that not only did they borrow the cells from everyone in order to create him, but he says here that in terms of when he went back in time, Piccolo asked him, but why did it take 3 years after you came back to this time? 3 years as a nymph beneath the earth. That's what took so long for me to mature from an egg. And then one last question. Why did you come here from the future? What's the point? And this is the point where he explains in depth that he wanted to collect the androids, absorb them so that he could become perfect because they didn't exist in that future. And then he says, but why did you choose 3 years ago? I didn't. Trunks had pre-programmed the machine to that year, and I just pushed the button. At this point, Piccolo speculates that he was coming back to tell them that he destroyed the androids, but the thing is that Cell actually went back a year before Trunks ever arrived, which would have been before Trunks had introduced himself to Goku and the others, so none of them ever would have known that he was going back in time, which you can say is a plot hole. I talked about that in other videos on my channel. Nonetheless, the point is, because Cell went back 1 year before Trunks did, Cell created a new timeline, which was the main timeline, circumventing the other timeline that Trunks had created and the earlier point in the history of Trunks, as well as those other timelines. So he created this one and inadvertently also created the other Trunks timeline, because of the fact that this Trunks went back to the timeline that Cell had already changed, which in turn meant that this new Trunks, would have his timeline changed and he wouldn't eventually go on and be killed by Cell. So that's the in-universe mechanics. We know for a fact that there are at least 4 timelines in Dragon Ball Z because of this. However, what ends up happening in terms of the narrative is that when Trunks arrives from the future to fight Frieza, which we'll see momentarily when I get to that right now, Frieza and his father show up, one of the most wasted potential characters in the franchise I talked about plenty of times on my channel, and then Trunks shows up, and he's ready to kill Frieza, and he actually does that because Trunks doesn't mess around. He wipes people out, chops them up, blows them away. King Cold thinks he can win just because he has a sword. Not quite, and then he gets blown away too. So you can even see his tail left over after he gets disintegrated. And maybe that's where the cells came from for Cell. Guess you weren't that thorough, Trunks. But nonetheless, the idea that what actually happened, and according to the topic of this video, is that for the entire story up until this moment, we actually were following the original timeline. However, what actually happens is that when we switch over to this chapter, it actually now switches over to another timeline, the main timeline. In other words, what this means is that the Trunks that we see here is also a duplicate. You could argue that maybe we're following the history of Trunks timeline, but nonetheless, we know that this Trunks is not the original Trunks. However, we also know that none of these characters, Frieza, King Cold, or even the Earthlings that are watching everything go down, are actually the real ones that we were following the entire story. That's what this theory proposes. Every single character that we follow from the Cell Saga onward is actually a duplicate of the characters that we grew to know and love over the course of the story up until Namek, which means that Vegeta, Tien, Krillin, Chaozu, Gohan, Piccolo, everyone in here, and Goku, and every single person that we see throughout the course of the franchise after this point, other than when we go to the history of Trunks' future and stuff, are, in fact, different versions of these characters. They're duplicates. They're strangers in a sense. They are not the ones that we actually followed the entire time. They are themselves timeline variants, which means that the real characters that we actually followed up until this point are all dead and gone. Every single one of them got killed by the androids. Goku died of the heart virus, or, they might have eventually even been wiped out by Zeno in Dragon Ball Super. So as a result, every single character we followed in the original franchise no longer exists potentially, and had a very dark outcome that we never even saw happen on screen, with the exception of the history of Trunks, which itself was a duplicate of the original timeline, which is where Cell came from, which means the only real Trunks, the only original Trunks we were ever introduced to was in the flashback scene in which Cell, the original Cell from the original timeline, killed off. So, Cell is the only character in that case that actually is from the true timeline that we had followed according to this theory up until that point. The combination of the cells from the original characters who were eventually defeated by the duplicates, the variants, with Goku, and then, of course, Gohan is the one who actually defeated him, and then Cell was defeated in the future Trunks timeline as a different variant of Cell then and there. Hopefully I didn't just blow your guys' minds and leave them all over the floor around you so you have to pick them up, but nonetheless, the point of the matter is that this is what the theory proposes, which does kind of significantly impact a lot of how we could view the story. That every character that we knew and loved actually had their real ending in the Frieza arc, and then everything afterward is following other characters. And you know, people have also proposed this idea possibly for Dragon Ball Super, that perhaps in Dragon Ball Super, that's the reason why there are so many inconsistencies, so many plot holes potentially, so many differences between the manga version and then the actual version that we get in Dragon Ball Super, because it's actually a different timeline, and maybe the narrative once again shifted, and this time, who knows, maybe it takes place in the unseen timeline, or, you know, maybe another timeline created altogether, because after all, we do know in the Dragon Ball manga, the Super one at least, that there was a time traveler in Universe 12. We don't know when that happened, so maybe that's where Super came from. Maybe in the manga version, it really was 10 years of peace, and then everything led off into a different direction, maybe even into GT. But in Dragon Ball Super, maybe it shifted timelines again. Maybe it did shift timelines for Dragon Ball GT. And that's all a way of explaining in-universe and out why everything is different. So this one theory could potentially kind of change up or give you guys some kind of headcanon to explain away a lot of those things in and out of universe. But what do you guys think? Do you think that Dragon Ball actually switched timelines during the future Trunks storyline of Dragon Ball Z? Or do you think that perhaps this is just a theory that itself might actually not have much weight to it? Overall, I do feel like if this actually is the case, it does diminish much of what we see in the Cell Saga onward narratively, because the fact that these are all different characters, they're not really the ones that we knew and loved. But ultimately, it doesn't really change their struggles and what they're going through and the way that we kind of bond to them, other than the fact that we would have to kind of go in with the mindset that they aren't the characters we already knew. But let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
And you better subscribe!